using African American women as a kind of window onto the American Revolution transforms the way we understand the American Revolution. Again, it seems to me that much of what slave owners were fighting for, liberty, freedom, independence, is exactly what African American women and men were fighting for when they opposed the men who we call the Founding Fathers. The British were very strategic in how they dealt with slaves in especially in the American South, in the plantation area. They offered freedom to any slave who would leave the plantation and come to the British Army camps. The goal, of course, was not particularly to give African Americans freedom. The goal was to disrupt the economy of the South and disrupt the food sources of the American revolutionaries, and to cause general chaos in communities. And they started this as early as 1775. Even before independence had been declared, the governor of Virginia issued a proclamation that said that any slave willing to abandon traitorous planters would be given his freedom. The American response to this is rather telling. That is, the response of the House of Burgesses, which we think of as the great source of liberty in America, was that any slave who did this and was caught would be executed or sent to the West Indies, which was the equivalent of execution, because life on the sugar plantations was brief and really quite horrible. To the surprise, I think, of Governor Dunmore, the women and men and children flocked, if they were in the vicinity, to the British encampments. And they formed an African regiment of soldiers that they called, when fighting broke out, that they called the Ethiopian Regiment. And across their chests they wore a banner with one word on it, and the word on it was liberty. And so right away I think you can understand that there were different agendas in the American Revolution. Anywhere the British Army went in the South, they tended to issue proclamations like this. That is, the generals issued proclamations like this. And I have accounts in my book, Revolutionary Mothers, of women who walked 50 miles with a baby in their arms and a child, holding a child's hand, to get to the British Army encampments so that they could gain their freedom from slavery. The story of how these people were treated is almost uniformly a tragic story. For instance, the Ethiopian regiment and the women and children that joined the African American men, when smallpox or some form of communicable disease broke out among their ranks, the British Army abandoned them on an island in the Chesapeake and left them, healthy ones as well as stricken ones, left them there to die, because they said, we don't want our soldiers to be infected. And that story is really a model for what is going to happen to African Americans seeking their freedom throughout the American Revolution. These women who walked miles to get to the British Army camp, like the men who walked to the British Army camp, risking their lives, because if they were caught, it was a death sentence. When they got there, they were really not given enough food to remain healthy enough to ward off all those communicable illnesses that spread through encampments like this. Many, many more soldiers were stricken, white and black, were stricken by communicable diseases, by what they came to be called camp fever. Anything that hit was called camp fever. But if you're undernourished and underclothed and were not given sufficient blankets, if you were really, in many cases, worse off than you were on your plantation, then you were susceptible to illness. African American men rarely were allowed to fight. Instead, they were given jobs like building roads or digging moats or ditches, or all the kind of grunt work, the physical labor that was involved to protect the British Army. Lots and lots of these people died. That is, they did not survive through the war. The men and women who did, and children who did survive when the war was over, as I'm sure you probably know, the Loyalists were evacuated from America and, on the whole, settled in Canada. African Americans were evacuated like white Loyalists from 2 points, from Charleston and from New York City, which celebrated Evacuation Day, by the way, for many, many years after the American Revolution. That is, it was celebratory for the Americans who had won the war that these terrible Loyalists were being forced to leave and go into exile. In New York, they didn't have enough Royal Navy ships to take everybody who wanted to leave. And so they commissioned merchant marine ships to carry people to Canada. When they boarded African Americans on these ships, as soon as the ships got out to sea, the crew put the African Americans in irons, in manacles, put them down in the hold of the ship, took the ship to the West Indies, and sold these people into slavery. To his credit, when Admiral Birch heard what was going on, he was in charge of the evacuation. When he heard what was going on, he said, "This is dishonorable. This is a tragedy." And he said, "We are going to make out inventories of every African American who gets on a ship. And if those people don't get off the ship in Canada, you will not be paid." One of the ironic results of this is we know more about African Americans in the second half of the 18th century because of this inventory. It became known as the Book of Negroes, and it included not just the names of the African Americans who were boarded onto these ships, but a physical description of them, including any tribal markings or any tattoos or any scars from having been whipped that they had on their bodies. It included their ages, or as close to their ages in some cases as they could discover, any trades or crafts or skills that they had, whether the women had children, and if they had children, even if the children weren't with the women on the ships, how many they had. And so there's a wealth of information about African American life that comes out of this inventory that was done in order to protect African American loyalists from I want to use the word evil, from the behavior of these ship captains who wanted to make money. They weren't the only ones who did something like this. Even during the war, British soldiers who happened upon, if there was a patrol of British soldiers who happened upon these women or men traveling to the army camp, they told them, "Oh, you're safe with us, we'll escort you." And as soon as they were in their hands, they tied them up and they sold them back to American planters. So the disillusionment and the mistreatment of African Americans who had been searching for their own freedom and their own independence is really the thread that runs through everything that I discovered in my research. When they got to Canada, they had been promised by the British government, who behaved really quite honorably toward white loyalists and black loyalists. They had been guaranteed land, supplies to make it through the first year, not political rights, but freedom. When they got there, the white loyalists, including several of the churches, stole the land, confiscated the land. There was violence against the African Americans by the whites. There were the equivalent of race riots. There was one story of an African American minister who was very well liked, and a group of white families asked him to baptize their children. When the larger white community heard this, they burned the church to the ground, and they attacked the African Americans in that town. What eventually happened, because the land was taken from them and because the supplies that were supposed to be handed out to the black families and to the black loyalists to make it through the winter and through the next spring were taken by the white loyalists, confiscated by the white loyalists, African Americans began to gather in what are the equivalent of ghetto communities. One of the African American towns, by the way, was named Birchtown in honor of the admiral who had ensured their safety and their not being sold into the West Indies. In these towns, there was no employment. And when these African Americans would go out into the white communities like Halifax to try to find work, they would be attacked or arrested. It's no surprise that within a few years of the populating of Canada, 1,500 African American loyalists made a second exile voyage and went to Sierra Leone to start a new community of their own. There's no happy stories, really, if you look at the American Revolution through the eyes of African American women or African American men. It was even worse for the African Americans who remained behind in the new land of liberty, right, the United States. Washington had been very reluctant to allow free African Americans or enslaved African Americans to be armed to fight in the American Revolution, even though he was desperate for men to join his army. And the reasons were obvious. Southern slave owners were afraid that putting a gun in the hand of an African American would be a dangerous thing to do. I recently learned, by the way, that in World War I, the same fear existed, and African Americans who enlisted in the American Army were assigned non-combatant duty and not allowed to train with weapons, despite the fact that they were members of the American Army. And African American men who demanded the right to fight were sent to fight in the French Army. There are any number of African American men who received the equivalent of the Distinguished Service Cross from the French in the American, in the World War I, because of the same fear that arming black men was a dangerous thing to do in American society. So in the American Revolution, very few African Americans were allowed the route to freedom through participation in the American Army. After the war was over, Southerners increased the repression of their slave populations dramatically. The laws became harsher in the South, in part because so many slaves had run away from the plantations, seeking their own freedom. The Southern planters and the Southern establishment, political establishment, said, we'll make sure nothing like this ever happens again, and they enforced much tighter regulation. There were many more slave patrols of armed white men who went out to make sure no slave tried to run away from a plantation or from a farm where he or she was owned. And so life for African Americans in the South became more repressive after the American Revolution. It is true in the North that African American men and women were emancipated, but very, very slowly. Gradual emancipation was the rule of the day, so that you could they could end slavery in Pennsylvania, but if you were under 25, you couldn't be free till you were 25, and slave owners had several years before they had to begin the process of emancipation. And this is why Sojourner Truth in the 1820s could write, "I walked away from slavery in New York," because slavery still existed in New York in the 1820s. That's how gradual emancipation was. A state like Vermont that probably had one random black person was able to emancipate immediately. But in any state, and that included New York, where New York City had always had a large slave population working on the docks. Dutch farmers had slaves working on farms outside of New York City, and in Philadelphia, where there were enslaved men who worked as in artisan shops, in manufacturing, small-scale manufacturing in the city, and slave women who worked as domestic labor. In those states where slavery continued to be profitable to someone, emancipation was extremely gradual. In Massachusetts, of course, one of the most famous cases was a woman known as Mom Bet, B-E-T-T. Her name must have been Betty or Elizabeth, sued for her freedom. And Theodore Sedgwick, who later would become both a senator and an abolitionist, took her case and won her freedom. And she took as her name Elizabeth Freeman as a result. And the story goes that when she was asked, how did you learn about the Declaration of Independence? How did you learn that the revolution had been fought for freedom? A rather patronizing question, by the way. She replied that she listened and she understood what she heard. And so she's quite an important figure in the very slow movement toward the end of slavery in America, not only because she won her case, but because the man who served as her lawyer went on to fight against slavery in America. I searched long and hard for upbeat stories about what happened to African Americans in the American Revolution, either in the American South among the revolutionaries or in Canada. And sadly, I will tell you that I really did not find any. It's important to remember, I think, that the spirit of liberty, the idea of freedom, is something that you don't have to have a college education to comprehend and to be willing to risk your life for, because that's in fact what these slave women from the plantations did, and that's what the men who joined the Ethiopian regiment did. And they were never really, certainly ever granted equality, but in many cases they came to live a life in Canada that was as impoverished and as racially discriminated against as the one that they had left in America.